Hi, I'm Lynda Downing, and this is my case study for EDL 855, Module 9, When Ethics and Policies Collide. All right, so let's summarize the case. We have the unknown school district. We don't really know much about it. We can assume that it's large and it's an urban school district. Next, we have Rocket Junior High. It has a student population of 900 students. It seems to be urban, maybe on the south side of town, and much is unknown other than that. Next, we have the assistant principal, Richard Inman. This is his first year as assistant principal at Rocket Junior High. He is originally from the town and the south side of that town specifically. He has worked hard to create a relationship with some students from the south side who are at risk and who are considered the toughest kids, especially the leader of the group, James. Richards meets with the Southside kids after school and plays basketball with them. The relationship between Richard and the Southside group was beginning to show dividends. The students' grades had improved. They began making friends with other students outside of the group, and James had not been involved in a fight for some months. Richard called James to come to the office to discuss a tardy, the third for the week. James, fifth-hour teacher, had some concerns about James passing something to another student, David Ramos, in the hallway after being told to go to the office. The teacher believed that drugs had been exchanged. The other student, David Ramos, was an outstanding honor student and had appeared very nervous after the exchange with James. Richard asked the school police officer to retrieve David from class. Richard asked both boys, James and David, and the school police officer to come into his office, a decision he would later regret. Richard questioned David. David became teary-eyed and refused to answer any questions. The police officer searched David and found a pair of brass knuckles. Brass knuckles were considered a prohibited weapon, and the possession was a felony offense. The school police officer handcuffed David. James did speak up and stated that the brass knuckles were his. He did state he told David to hold them, to say nothing or he would beat him up. The admission of guilt was a big breakthrough for James. However, it did not change the outcome. Both James and David were taken to jail and charged with the felony possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. Both boys were then taken to the youth detention facility. Richard was very troubled by this outcome. He called both mothers of the boys. James's mother was not really fazed. David's mother was quite concerned and came to school. Richard had no answers for David's mother's questions, and Richard filed the paperwork on James for expulsion, but he could not bring himself to fill out the paperwork for David. He felt David was an innocent victim. James had had a history of intimidation tactics, especially on those he thought of as weak. Richard decided not to fill out the paperwork to have David expelled from school. He understood that it was a violation of school policy. David was allowed to return to school a week later. Richard did get a call from the director of secondary education. He was told to complete the paperwork on David in accordance with the school district's zero tolerance policy. Richard explained the situation and his decision to not complete the paperwork. The director was understanding, but informed Richard that an official reprimand would be placed in his file if Richard did not change his mind and comply. Next, we have the classroom teacher. Much is unknown. It's obviously James's fifth-hour teacher. She noticed that James and David exchanged something in the hallway after James had been called to the office. She believed it to be drugs. She called Richard to let him know this. She also mentioned David was quite nervous. The first student that we're going to talk about is James. He's a 15-year-old male who is muscular and has many tattoos. He comes from the south side of town. He is a ringleader of a group of boys also from the south side of town. He has been in and out of the youth juvenile detention many times. Richard, the assistant principal, was slowly building a relationship with James. This was beginning to show some positive results. James had not had a fight for many months, but did have a number of tardies that needed to be addressed. After being summoned to the office to discuss the tardies, James had an exchange with David Ramos. He was seen by the teacher giving something to David. It was later determined that James had brought brass knuckles to school and forced David Ramos to take them for safekeeping with the threat of physical violence against David. James did confess. However, both boys were handcuffed and taken to the youth detention center. James is now attending the district's Disciplinary Alternative Education Program, or DAEP, for 45 days minimum. The next student we have is David Ramos. He's a 13-year-old boy of slight build. He's an honor student and is the lead trombonist of the band. He was coerced into taking James' brass knuckles under the threat of physical violence. David is not part of James' friend group. He was scared and refused to answer the questions of the assistant principal, Richard Inman. Upon searching David, the school police officer found the brass knuckles. David was handcuffed by the school police officer. He was taken by the school police officer to the youth detention center and charged with the felony possession of a weapon on school property. David did return to school a week later and did not attend the AEP because the assistant principal, Richard Inman, did not file the paperwork to have David expelled. James's mother. Richard Inman's assistant principal called James's mother to inform her of the situation. According to Richard, James' mother was not terribly concerned and said she would let James stay in the youth detention center for a few days and hopes he would learn his lesson. Next is David's mother. Richard Inman, assistant principal, called David's mother. She hung up on Richard and was in the office 15 minutes later. She was very angry. She could not understand how her son had been taken when he was forced to take the weapon by another student, and Richard had no good answers for her. Last, we have the school police officer. Much is unknown. He was asked to retrieve David Ramos from class. After Davis Ramos refused to answer Richard Inman's questions, he searches David and finds the brass knuckles. He handcuffs David immediately after finding the weapon. He refuses to unhandcuff David after finding out David is forced by James to hold James's brass knuckles. He takes David and James to the youth detention center and charges both students with a felony possession of a prohibited weapon on school property. Okay, so now we'll talk about the legal and ethical issues. First, let's talk about the zero tolerance policy. It's a school policy widely used that emerged from the Gun-Free School Act of 1994. The act stated if a weapon was brought to school, the offender would be expelled for a school year. Schools were and are required to follow those guidelines for students who bring weapons to school. However, the American Psychological Association has concluded that zero tolerance was ineffective in either reducing individual misbehavior or improving school safety. The most concerning of the zero tolerance policies is the creation of the school-to-prison pipeline. There has been an increase of school security officers, especially in large schools. As a result, students have been introduced to the juvenile justice system. I've also included my summary on the zero tolerance policies from my school law class. I, of course, am not going to read through this at this time. That will make my presentation even longer. However, I will include, put a link to it in the comments under my case study presentation. So let's go on to the next part here. We have school police officers. Let's talk about the school police officer or resource officers. I have a very large concern about police officers in schools. First of all, I'm not 100% sure they're always highly trained and are used very carefully. And much too often, the use of school police or resource officer creates a direct pipeline into the juvenile court system. So the use of school police officers protocols. Schools should have specific protocols when using school police or resource officers. We must be careful not to turn our schools into pseudo-prisons. We are in a business of educating school-age children, not adults, and we must act accordingly. And lastly, the ethical concerns. This case places the assistant principal on the horns of definitely of an ethical dilemma. Having to choose what he believes is correct in trying to figure out what is the right way to proceed. Should his focus be to protect himself and his position at the school district, or should his focus be both the students who are involved? So let's synthesize what has happened. After choosing not to file the expulsion paperwork for a student who was physically intimidated into holding a weapon by another student who admittedly brought the weapon to school, the assistant principal, Richard Inman, receives a phone call from the director of secondary education who stated he needed to file the paperwork or risk a formal reprimand being placed in his personnel file. So let's talk about who's involved. First, we have the assistant principal, Richard Inman. Much is unknown about him. We don't know how old he is or how many years of experience he does have in the education field. what his role is as the assistant principal at Rocket Junior High. We don't know if he's supportive of his staff. Does he help manage classroom behaviors? How does his staff feel about him? Is he well liked? Is he seen as impartial and fair? Does he work to create meaningful relationship with all students and staff? And does he promote the well-being of his staff and students? It is well known that he has tried to spend some time with students who do seem to be at risk and did seem to be making some headway with that group of students. Next, we have James. James is a 15-year-old boy who is muscular and has many tattoos. He's from the south side of town. He is a leader of a group of students who also come from the south side of town. He is willing to sustain a relationship with the new assistant principal, Richard Inman. He did bring a pair of brass knuckles to school. He does not seem to have a supportive home life. We don't know if he has a father figure or if he has siblings at home. He has been doing better at school as of late, and he does confess that he made David Ramos take the brass knuckles. And we don't know if he's had any trouble with drugs in the past. We don't really know much about him. It's not really divulged why he brought the brass knuckles to school. Does he need them on the way home? Is he having to go home through a drug-infested gang territory, multiple gang territories before he's able to reach home? Does he have to use those to protect his life or his other children, his siblings, or we have that's really not stated. But it would be something that the assistant principal would need to find out. The teacher, the fifth hour teacher, much is unknown. She is a female. We don't know how old she is or how long she's been in education. What subject does she teach? And does she have a meaningful relationship with either James or David? So David Ramos, he's a 13-year-old boy. He's slight of build. He takes honors classes, plays in the band, and is the lead trombone player. He has had no disciplinary issues at school. He has a very concerned mother who dropped whatever she was doing to come to the school, and he was forced by James to take the brass knuckles under physical threat. So the school police officer, not much is known. How old is he? How much experience does he have with working with middle school students? Has he received any training from the school district on being a school police or resource officer? And does he try to create meaningful relationships with students, especially students who are at risk? Next, we have James's mother. Not much is known. She does not seem very supportive of James or has no idea what to do to change his behavior. We don't know how old she is. Does she have other children? Does she have a job? Is she a single parent? Next, we have David's mother. Also, much is unknown. She seemed very supportive of David. She comes to school quickly and is quite upset. Does she have other children? Does she have a job? And is she a single parent? So the director of secondary education, we do know that it's a male, but we don't know their name. We don't know very much about what their role is in the school district or how long they have been working in that position. That person is very concerned about following the zero tolerance policy. He does encourage the principal to follow the policy and expel David. If Richard chose not to comply, an official reprimand letter would be replaced in his personnel file. So where is this happening? There's an unknown school district. Nothing in that is mentioned. Of course, there must be a superintendent. It would be nice to know how the superintendent is involved in the schools, how many employees there are overall, and how many students do they serve, and how many schools are there. Next, we have Rocket Junior High. Not much is known. We don't know how many students. We do know that there's 900 students. However, we don't know how many of those are on free and reduced lunches. Is there a diverse population of students? How many staff members? How many teachers? Are most of the teachers new teachers or veteran teachers? Does the school promote distributive leadership? Is there a mentorship program? If so, is it effective and meaningful? Is there a diverse population of staff members? Does the staff reflect the diversity of the student population? How many administrators are there and what are their duties? Is the school well or poor performing? Does the school district struggle to adequately staff the school? Are there instructional coaches? If so, how many? Are there guidance counselors? If so, how many? What is their role in the school? Do they counsel students or do they just handle the scheduling? Is the building old or new? Is it accessible to all students and staff? Is the school set up by teams? Are Classrooms arranged accordingly? Is there technology readily accessible to staff and students? What electives are offered? What is the culture of the school? Does the administration work to create a collaborative, inclusive, and diverse culture? How often are administrators in classrooms? Are walkthroughs done consistently? Are walkthroughs done by multiple observers or only one? Are all teachers given actionable feedback in a timely, constructive, and consistent manner? What are their school initiatives? What are their foundational structures for KISA, and how are those being promoted? Is there a protocol for the use of school police or resource officers? Are officers adequately trained? How are they used? Is the creation of meaningful relationships with all students required and promoted? Next, we have the hallway. All we know is it's outside of James Fifth Hour teacher's classroom. We don't know if it's crowded. How is the students' population managed and monitored during passing periods and unstructured times? Are teachers required to be in the hallway during those passing periods? And lastly, we have the principal's office. Does the principal have an open door policy? Is he a good source of support and meaningful feedback to his staff? And does he spend all of his time in his office, or is he seen throughout the building? All right, so let's talk about what programs are involved. Once again, we have the school district self. It's not mentioned in the case study, but there are many questions. Some questions are, how many school police resource officers, how are school resource officers assigned to buildings? How many are there in the district? Are they required to be adequately trained before being assigned to a school? What kind of oversight does the district have over the school police officers? Do they work for the school or an outside agency such as the local police department? Okay, next is the Rocket Junior High. So how many administrators does Rocket Junior High have? How many school police or resource officers are there at Rocket Junior High? Are there any social service programs at the school? And what kinds of supports do both the students and staff receive, if any? So I was also wondering, do they have social workers? Often larger school districts, especially in schools of that side, do have social workers that are on staff. So it would be nice to know if they have that and how those people are being used. Next, let's talk about the administrative staff itself. Much is unknown. We only know the only person that's mentioned is the assistant principal. Is he the only one? Who are his supervisors? What are their role? And are there any social workers on staff? And if so, what is their role? All right, let's talk about review and analyze. Let's talk about the stakeholders. All right, we have the unknown town itself. It's not mentioned in the case study. We'll assume that the town is large and urban, and the diversity of the town population is unknown. Next, let's talk about the parents. We do have information on James and David's mothers that is addressed in the case study, but parents as a whole are not. Are the parents involved in the school community? What are the demographics of the parent population of the school? Is there high level free and reduced lunches? Next, we have the school board. The school board is not mentioned in the case study. It is assumed it is an elective school board and not appointed. Is there a parent from the unknown school on the school board? How many minorities are on the school board, or are they all Caucasian? Are all minorities adequately represented in the running of the school district? Does the board value professional education in the staff, and are they willing to help pay for it? Next, we have community members. That's also not mentioned in the case study. However, it is no doubt that the unknown town schools are important to community members. Often schools are a major employer in towns both large and small. So the superintendent is not mentioned in the case study. And I'm assuming it's a large school district, so there probably are multiple superintendents with multiple responsibilities. So now we have the staff of the Rocket Junior High. It's not mentioned in the case study. My question is, how many staff members are there? Are there counselors, principals, a number of teachers per grade? If they have elective teachers, a number of special education teachers, number of office staff, number of paras, both special education and otherwise. And lastly, we have the staff of the unknown school district. How many are there? What is the number of minorities as teachers in high-level positions? Are they well paid? Is the pay fair and based on experience? All right, so now let's talk about what are the steps for ethical and legal decision-making process for administrators to follow. First, they need to take time to define the problem. Leaders need to decide why an ethical decision needs to be made and the outcomes that are desired for the decision. They need to consult resources and seek advice. Leaders need to work on developing a strategy using the resources and people around them. Think about the lasting effects. Teachers should filter any advice for how to handle an issue through a lens of how it will affect others. Consider regulations in other industries. Leaders should be refer to regulations and standards that other companies have established. It would be a good starting place for developing ethical strategies. Decide on a decision. Leaders need to determine a final decision and how to present that decision. Implement and evaluate. Leaders need to facilitate the implementation of ethical decisions. Now we have the evaluate and analyze ethical decisions. Stakeholder perspectives. All stakeholders should have an opportunity to voice their views about the issue, staff, community, parents, and etc. Evidence. Include risks and benefits to the organization, the impact of the situation on the quality of service, and the best practices. Contextual features, internal and external directives and partnerships, legal considerations, and the public opinion. And evaluate. What are the possible harms to various stakeholders? What are the probable benefits to various stakeholders? What will be the impact on the staff, our mission, and quality of care? What duties, principles, and values support this opinion? Does this set a good example? Does it make things easier or harder for others to do the right thing? And choose the option with the best consequences overall and closest alignment with key duties, principles, and values. So how does one communicate and advocate ethical and legal decisions? Ethical communications is a type of communication that is predicated upon certain business values such as being truthful, concise, and responsible with one's words and the resulting actions. Principles of ethical communication. Be truthful and honest. Communicate what is known to be 100% true facts with no intent to deceive or present only parts of the truth. Active listening. Proactively listen to the speaker and not just hear what you want to hear or to hear only parts of the conversation. Speak non-judgmentally. Speak in a non-judgmental manner with every recipient. Helping with unnecessary conflict, which typically breaks down communication, causes a breakdown in communication and causes misunderstanding. Speak from your own experience. Bring your personal experiences into a dialogue with business listeners is important. Providing backup with your arguments with something is more tangible. Consider the receiver's preferred communication channel. Use the most preferred communication channel, such as face-to-face, email, conference call, phone call, or a messenger app, etc. How does one? Okay, so this is continued. You need to strive to understand. Strive to fully understand what is being said before responding. Avoid a negative tone. Avoid rudeness. Be polite and professional and have tact. How you say something is as important as what you say. Do not interrupt others. Allow others to speak. It creates a civil, effective working environment. Respect privacy and confidentiality. Include a clause in your code of ethics defining what is appropriate when it comes to honoring client and employee confidentiality and privacy. Accept responsibility. Take responsibility for the actions that results from one's words, whether good or bad, including both short-term and long-term consequences of one's communications. Owning one's words reinforces the importance of being conscientious about ethical communication. How does one model ethical behavior in their personal conduct and relationships? So we have the principles of ethical leadership and education. Personal courage. Be willing to stand up against policies that are not helpful or for their students risk rising against local, state, and national interests. Public interest ahead of self. Put what is best for students and staff ahead of the needs of yourself as a leader. Self-control, self-discipline, integrity. Be a positive role model and force in the lives of the stakeholders. Take an employee-centeredness. Create a foundation of success that draws from the strengths of the teachers and staff who interacts with the students. Focus on both the needs of students and the needs of the staff when making decisions. Recognize talent. Recognize the talent of the staff. Identify both staff and students who display the qualities of excellence, and then go on to recognize and promote those individuals. Requiring high ethics from everyone. Concern yourself with the ethics standards of all in your organization, including teachers, staff, students, and parents. Sensitivity and understanding. Understand the political, social, and economic environment of the stakeholders of the school setting. And inclusiveness. Bring all stakeholders in the process of making and implementing decisions. So, how does one cultivate ethical behaviors in others? 7 tips for successful ethical leadership. Define and align your values. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Demonstrate how adhering to specific values benefits the mission of the organization. Hire people with similar values. Having and hiring people who share your values is critical. Promote open communication. Create an environment where open communication is encouraged and that, more importantly, people are listened to. Beware of bias. No leader wants to admit their flaws, but failure to practice self-awareness can have detrimental consequences. Lead by example. Your employees will see your behavior, choices, and values and will adopt them into their own practices. Find your role models. Search powerful leaders who you identify with and try to implement their ideas into your own leadership style. Care for yourself so you're able to care for others. Take time for yourself. The leader that is happy and content in life wants happiness and contentment for those they lead. So, how does one implement ethical decision making and behavior within a school setting? You need to have a code of ethics. Make the education and well-being of students the fundamental value of all decision making. Fulfills all professional duties with honesty, integrity, and always acts in a trustworthy and responsible manner. Supports the principle of due process and protect the civil and human rights of all individuals. Implement local, state, and national laws. Advise the school board and implements the board's policies and administrative rules and regulations. Pursues appropriate measures to connect these laws, policies, and regulations that are not consistent with sound educational goals or that are not in the best interest of children. Accept academic degrees or professional certification only from accredited institutions. Maintains the standards and seeks the improvement of effectiveness of profession through research and continuing professional development. Honors all contracts until fulfilled, release, or dissolution mutually agreed upon by all parties. Accepts responsibility and accountability for one's own actions and behaviors, and commits to serving others above themselves. So let's talk about what options that I've thought about. First of all, the principal could do nothing. He could just continue on and hope for the best. So this does keep the peace a little bit and it does seem easier in the short term. In the long term, he will not be doing his job to the best of his ability. Davis Ramos will continue to attend Rocket Junior High, but his reputation may or not be damaged, and he does risk a reprimand being placed in his personal file. Next, we have what I call keep the peace. He could complete the expulsion paperwork for David Ramos. The pros is it's easier for the principal's career in the long run. The cons are Davis Ramos will be in the DAEP program and may face felony charges. It may damage your reputation, damages my reputation, and damages the school's reputation. Now we'll talk about my choice. First of all, we need to spend some time talking to the superintendent and the director of secondary education, along with the Rocket Junior High head principal, to determine what needs to be done. I would have a discussion with the superintendent about David Ramos, explain my position and concerns about completing the paperwork for Davis Ramos, who, in my opinion, was victimized in this situation. I also will be telling them I will not be completing the paperwork myself. My greatest concern is the paperwork could be used against David in the court of law as a guilt of having a weapon at school, a weapon that he did not bring to school. But to have a discussion about James and my interest in continuing building and sustaining a relationship by visiting him at the DAEP program on at least a weekly basis. I'd also wanted to have a discussion of my plan to work with the school district on creating a set of protocols for the use of the school police resource officers in school. Next, we have my discussion with the head principal about the use of protocols for school resource officers in schools, a need for social workers and social services at school if none exists, and how I can help with the implementation of those services. Explain my point of view about not completing the expulsion paperwork for David Ramos and my concern about the paperwork being used against David. However, I must fully understand that there is a high probability that the head principal will choose to complete the expulsion paperwork themselves, or may choose to include a formal reprimand in my personnel file with the understanding that I may be removed from my position or asked to resign. So the pros is it maintains my relationships as a fair and impartial leader. David Ramos will not be attending the DAEP and will not face felony charges, and hopefully maintains my relationship with those students and their parents. The con is Richard Emmon may have a reprimand placed in his or her file. He may have to resign or be forced to resign. So we have the implementation of my decision. First, I would check board policy for the zero tolerance policy and the use of school police resource officers. I'd have a discussion with the superintendent, communicate with the superintendent on a daily basis via email or in person. Discussion with the head principal of Rocket Junior High. Develop and implement protocols for the use of school resource officers, social workers, and social services. Continue to meet with the Southside students on a daily basis. Meet with James at the DAEP program on a weekly basis. Of course, I would have to have meetings with James and James's mother, David Ramos and David Ramos's mother, the school police resource officer, any staff members who are directly work with James and or David Ramos. And I'd have a meeting with, hopefully, with the staff social workers and the head of social services at school, if any. Meet weekly in person with the head principal to discuss my progress. I'd have to have a willingness to change or modify the plan on a needed basis and have patience because change takes time. So here are the resources that I used in my presentation, additional resources. And lastly, here's my reflection. The process of completing this case study has allowed me to further my understanding of my own ethical and moral code. I found the case study challenging. It allowed me to think as a future school leader or principal. As a future special education administrator, I will need to be able to ensure the needs of students with disabilities are met. I'm quite sure there will come a time that I will be required to deal with this very situation. A student with a disability has specific rights in those situations. I will need to be able to effectively communicate those rights to ensure the student continues to receive the services they require to be successful. So thank you very much for your time listening to my presentation, and thank you for listening and during my time in this class.